Okay, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'll be the moderator for our talk today. My name is Nicholas Witkowski, and I'm a professor of the history of Asian religions here at NTU. This is the second lecture in the NTU History Seminar Series of the year, of the academic year, and the first in a new series for our NTU Religion Research Initiative. Today, I'm very excited to welcome Professor Bryan Lowe of Princeton to NTU today. He is an assistant professor of religion at Princeton and a specialist in the Buddhism of ancient Japan, that is a period that covers from the 7th to the 9th centuries, or early Japan. His work is central to the rethinking of Japanese Buddhism. And one of the reasons why I wanted to invite Professor Lowe to speak to us is because his work interrogates, it problematizes, and even corrects earlier scholarly conceptions of ancient Japanese Buddhism and even ancient Japanese history. The classic models for understanding Japanese Buddhism tended to focus on state patronage and state control over religion in ancient Japan. However, Professor Lowe's fantastic book, Ritualized Writing, which came out in 2017, critiques this impersonal model of state Buddhism and focuses much more on the experiences and practices of individual believers and communities of believers. If Professor Lowe doesn't mind me saying so, not only his book Ritual Writing, but much of his oeuvre resonates with the great tradition of the annal, that is to say, those histories from below, which focus on the overlooked or ignored experiences of non-elites in Japanese society. Professor Lowe's work is also extremely important as a model of scholarship because he doesn't presume that religions are simply a product of politics, something we are wont to do in history quite a lot. He strives to understand the religious and the political in history as a two-way street, and his work emphasizes that religious practices have substantially reshaped the societies in which they operate. His most recent piece, which is conceptually connected to a new project that he's working on and connected to the lecture that he'll be delivering to us today, is called Roads, State, and Religion in Japanese Antiquity. It appeared in the journal The History of Religions in 2020. And in this article, and I believe in the project more generally, Professor Lowe is opening up exciting new approaches to thinking about the relationship of mutuality between Buddhist practice and the early Japanese state. The importance in particular of connectivities, not only within the realm of the political, but within the Japanese Buddhist imaginaire. The format for Professor Lowe's talk today is that of a lecture followed by question and answers. Professor Lowe will speak for about 40 minutes, maybe a little less. And during the talk, please do enter your questions in the chat window. We always say this, and then we always have to wait a few minutes afterwards for people to actually put their questions in. Put them in when you think of them, don't wait. During the talk, please enter your questions in the chat window, and I'll collate those questions during the lecture and try to get through as many as possible afterwards. I'll also be putting the Twitter handles for NTU History and for the new NTU Religion Initiative in the chat window. Please do follow us on these platforms, as there will be regular updates about upcoming events, fellowship information, and publications. A brief note, the next talk for our Religion Initiative will be on November 12th at 9:30 a.m. Singapore time, the same time, and it will be delivered by Jennifer Graber on Claiming the Dead, Religion in the Reclamation of Human Remains. With that, I'd like to hand the platform over to Professor Bryan Lowe. Bryan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, and thank you, Nick, for such a generous introduction. I feel like you explained my work to me so that I actually understand it better than I ever did before. So thank you. It clarified actually a lot. That was really great. You might need to write the introduction to my next book or something so I can kind of say it so clearly. I also just want to thank everyone at NTU for organizing this. It's sad that I can't be in Singapore, but at the same time, it's great to be here online with so many people that I can see, and just I quickly scanned through the names and the participant list, and it's great to see a lot of old friends and some new friends as well. I know how busy everyone's Zoom calendars are these days, so I just want to thank everyone for taking the time. I'm going to start my timer here to make sure I stay on time. and I'm going to share screen. I know that if I don't say share screen, I think my impression is that if I don't say share screen, something like kind of Candyman or something like that comes up from the screen from Zoom. I think this is something you need to say that you're going to do. So here it goes. Let's share, and hopefully everyone can see it. So my talk today is called Preaching Poverty in Ancient Japan. I've been trying to go for much more straightforward, descriptive titles in my everything more and more recently.
Nick Witkowski, everybody's here.
Hi, Jamie.
Sorry.
Whoops, somehow it skipped ahead. Okay. So I want to start with a poem. And this is a relatively well-known poem from the 8th century Japan by one of my favorite poets, Yamano and Okuda. And I just have an excerpt here from a poem that's called Dialogue on Poverty. Somehow my PowerPoint's going crazy. Okay. Here's the excerpt. I toil to make my living on the land, yet must I throw rags about my shoulders, mere rotten shreds of a sleeveless frock, hemp with no padding, dangling like branches of sea pine over my bones. And in this crazy hut, this flimsy, tumbling hovel, surrounded by grief and hungry, piteous cries. But on the hearth, no kettle sends up clouds of steam, and in our pot, a spider spins its web. We have forgotten the very way of cooking rice. So the poem is framed as a dialogue between a poor person and a destitute person, and we just heard from the destitute person. The destitute person is so poor that their robes are falling apart, right? Their clothes are dangling like branches of sea pine over their bones, not offering very much warmth. The family is surrounding him and crying, and they have so little food that they don't even use their pot to the extent that a spider has taken up residence within. So this is a story of extreme poverty, and we can imagine that in ancient Japan, there were a number of people like this. So the question that's kind of driving my talk today is, what hope was there in the Buddhist tradition for such a person in ancient Japan? Could Buddhism offer anything? Did Buddhism speak to such a person? Did such a person hear Buddhist teachings? And if so, how did they respond? Before I kind of answer that question, I just want to give an overview of what the talk is going to look like. So I'm just going to kind of run through an outline very quickly. I'm going to begin by going over some of the historiography. How have people kind of thought about, or I'll really kind of say, not thought about the question that I just asked in the past. I'll talk a little bit about my past work and my current project and how that all kind of fits together to situate this presentation I'm giving today. I should say that the presentation I'm giving today is based on a chapter draft for an in-process book project. So I very much welcome and encourage not only questions, but comments. I actually like comments, not just questions, and critique. I'm pretty thick-skinned, and I think every criticism that I get, I'd rather have now than later. So don't hesitate to do so. After I kind of go over the past, particularly historiography, I'm going to talk a little bit about the sources. I use somewhat unusual sources in Buddhist studies and not particularly well-known sources. So I think it's important to think about them, because part of my argument will be that to see Buddhism in ancient Japan in new ways, we have to look at new materials. I'm then going to outline traveling preachers. My theme of my talk today is about how traveling preachers created certain doctrines that seem to be directed toward people like those in the poem. But to understand that, we have to, first of all, establish that some of the sources we're using are actually tied to traveling preachers. And second, get kind of a general sense of who they are and where they are preaching. So I'll try to outline some of that. I'm then going to get kind of into the actual parts that are dealing with poverty. And this section on poverty is going to be divided into 3 parts with one kind of aside. The first is preaching poverty and focusing on a discourse of gift giving. And what I'm going to try to show in this section is how there were a discourse of gift giving that was inclusive of even relatively poor members of society. Then I'll try to use archaeological evidence to show that people indeed offered humble gifts that seem to respond very closely to the type of sermons they might have heard. And then I'll turn to another strategy in preaching, which is for those who are so destitute, so poor, that they cannot make any offering whatsoever. And then I'll end with a kind of a discourse on karma that gives a somewhat ambivalent attitude towards poverty, that both in some ways criticizes the poor for their past moral failings, but also points out that ultimately poverty is not a permanent condition. And then I'll wrap up, basically kind of just reiterating everything I said again, in case you missed it. So you can really just shut off. I'm 5 minutes into it. You can shut off for 30 minutes, come back, and you'll just hear all the conclusions in the last 5 minutes or so, or last 2 minutes or so. So to return to our question, what hope was there in the Buddhist tradition for such a person, for a destitute person in ancient Japan? So how have people answered this question before me? I would say the answer historically is meh. In a lot of ways, people haven't really answered this question. It's been a question that I won't say no one has really answered it, but it's been a question that has been largely ignored or not even considered to be possible to ask for the period of ancient Japan, namely the 7th through 9th centuries. So why did people kind of adopt this meh attitude? I think it's an interesting question, right? Why did no one address it before? Well, I think part of this has to do with some of the kind of historiographical biases we've had towards the study of pre-modern Japanese Buddhism. One of these, whoops, I skipped. Somehow it's very sensitive. Everything keeps skipping ahead too much. Okay, so one of these historiographical narratives is what's known as the state Buddhism model. So pictured here is an image of the great Buddha at Todaiji, which is kind of seen as the pinnacle of state Buddhism in Japan. And the state Buddhism model, put simply, argues that the state both regulated Buddhism through laws and promoted Buddhism, relying on it largely for ritual, kind of magical purposes of state protection. All of these things are true. So when I'm criticizing the state Buddhism model in my past work and in my present work to an extent, I'm not saying that's not true, but what I would like to point out today is that that's true for Buddhism just about everywhere, right? There's always been state efforts to regulate and control Buddhism. Kings have almost always, where Buddhism has succeeded, have almost always relied on Buddhism for protection. It's not really a characteristic of Buddhism in ancient Japan, as much as it's just a characteristic of Buddhism 101. Moreover, that's not all that there was to ancient Japanese Buddhism. And so because for kind of complicated reasons tied to 19th and 20th century politics, tied to Japanese imperialism to some degree, as well as kind of ideas about secularization, this narrative has taken hold that the Nara period is defined by state Buddhism alone, which has led people to ignore other aspects of Buddhism in the 7th, 8th, and early 9th centuries. So that's one of the problems that's gotten in our way. We've had our blinders on because we've been taught that there's nothing else. A second historiographical problem, although I would say less of a problem, but still one worth pointing out, the main manuscript I'm going to be focusing on today is from the very early Heian period. And when we talk about the very early Heian period, we tend to focus a lot on two monks, two very important monks who we have really excellent scholarship in English on. So, I mean, a wonderful classic book by Paul Groner, who I think I saw might be here, on Sideshow, and another wonderful, excellent book by Kukai on Yuichi Abe, and a lot of other really exciting work by people like Matt McMullen these days on Kukai and what Kukai did and did not write. But these two figures have received a lot of attention. In some ways, it's justifiable because these two figures really did, I think, one could argue convincingly that they really did change Japanese Buddhism in many ways. But I simply want to suggest that we can also ask other questions and look at other figures beyond these two. And I want to kind of try to turn the lens to somewhere else today. Now, I should say in my project, Sideshow does actually come up in the larger book project because he too was active preaching in Eastern Japan, which we'll see as one of my themes. The final and perhaps most damaging narrative that we deal with is a narrative of Kamakura popularization. This is a narrative that argues that schools that were founded by figures active in the 12th and 13th centuries, figures such as Honen, pictured here, Shinran, Nichiren, that these figures brought Buddhism to the broader populace for the first time. This narrative emerged particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries at a time when the sects founded in the Kamakura period, those sects founded in the 12th and 13th centuries, or said to be founded at that time, when those sects were intellectually and economically and politically dominant. And so when these sectarian founders were when these sectarian scholars were tracing their history in the 19th and 20th century, one of the things they looked at is comparisons with Europe. And for example, they wanted to look at for comparisons with the Protestant Reformation and said that, hey, we have kind of our own similar figures who introduced unmediated practices that really took the concerns of regular people seriously for the first time. Now, I'm painting everything in very broad strokes in this overview. All of the arguments are more nuanced than this, and I've learned a great deal from all of the scholarship that I'm kind of trying to very gently critique. But my point that I want to emphasize today is that that narrative, that sectarian narrative, again, has made us not think to look as much for popularization earlier, because we've been told so many times that it's something that's characteristic of a later period. So Nick talked a little bit about my first book, Ritualized Writing. In the first book, I tried to combat that narrative in a few different ways. And one of the ways that I tried to combat it was to point out the role that sutra copying played in diverse people's lives. So I looked at, for example, people that worked as very low-level laborers in scriptoria. These include scribes, but it also includes people who assembled, who like glued the scrolls together. It included women who did laundry, and a diverse kind of cast of characters. It also included villagers out in the provinces who pooled all of their resources together. Sometimes a group of a few hundred people would pool all their resources together to sponsor a sutra copying project. And I think the argument hopefully successfully showed, I do think the biggest success of the book is actually the purple Keller, which I have to thank Stephanie Chu, for my editor, for choosing the Keller. But if there's another success of the book beyond the Keller, I hope it tried to show that Buddhism had reached a lot of different people. But I think a failure of the book, as I reflect on it, is it didn't really explain how. It didn't really explain what about Buddhism might be attractive to these people, who were the people that were really kind of bringing Buddhism and spreading it. I talk a little bit about that, but I don't talk about it enough. What social kind of forces were necessary to allow Buddhism to spread, to travel, what infrastructure was necessary, how did this kind of come about? I don't think I did a good enough job explaining. So my second book that I'm working on now, hoping to finish by the end of this academic year, at least a very rough draft, is called How Buddhism Spread in Ancient Japan. It's trying to answer this very question. And when I'm talking about spread here, I mean particularly to the provinces, although as we'll see today, it's also a question of social class. So chapters 1 through 3 of the book really focus on networks and mobility. I have two chapters that focus on temple construction and tie them closely to highway infrastructure, but also kind of local social networks in the provinces. And then the third chapter looks at kind of the darker side of the traveling and of the networks. And for those of you who have read the piece in History of Religions that is circulated before the talk, that's kind of all coming from chapters 1 through 3. The second part of the book says we can't explain the spread of a religion only by considering networks and mobility. Although a lot of scholars have tried, that's not enough. We also have to pay attention to messaging. What's the content of the doctrines that preachers and other people are spreading? What are the rhetorical strategies that they use? And so I consider things like homiletics, as well as a variety of Buddhist doctrines. And what I'll be presenting in the remainder of the talk today is from chapter 5 of the book. So it's coming from the second half of the project. So that's kind of all just background to situate where this material kind of fits in, both into the broader study of pre-modern Japanese religions and within my own research agenda, as well as this current project that I'm working on. So to turn to the sources. So my first main source of the project is kind of really centered on is this text that's called Draft of Todaiji Liturgies, is how I'm translating it. Todaiji Fujimonko. This text is, the title of the text is actually a modern invention. We don't know what the text was originally called. We don't even really know if it was tied to a monk from Todaiji, although it seems reasonable that it could have been. I'll talk more about the author of the text in a minute. The original manuscript was actually destroyed in firebombing, unfortunately, in April of 1945. It almost made it to the end of the war, but it didn't. But we do fortunately have colotype editions. So this is a form of reproduction that was very popular in the early 20th century, a color kind of copy version of the text. And I'm fortunate that I was able to acquire my own version. So I actually have my own manuscript kind of in scroll form of a reproduction made in the 1930s. So what this text is it's written on the verso, on the back of a commentary of the Avatamsaka Sutra, Korean commentary. And it's seems to be notes that are used as kind of a crib of something that a preacher who was traveling probably from the capital into the provinces, and I'll provide evidence for that in a moment, was using for sermons. Now, he doesn't seem to have read right off of the manuscript. If you can see, the background is the manuscript. It's pretty messy and it's got all these blank spaces. but rather it's likely kind of a group of materials that he could use and draw from to compose sermons that he would then deliver in the sites. The sites, as I will argue, seem to be villages, and possibly even some have argued and suggested villages in Eastern Japan. The second set of evidence that I use is archaeological evidence, and this is a whole range of materials, including mokkan, pieces of wood with writing on them, ink-inscribed pottery, bokushodoki, roof tiles, which I didn't list here, village temple sites, so like the features of the site themselves. And this is really important because where drafted Todaiji liturgies might tell us what people in villages heard, archaeological evidence, I will suggest, can sometimes maybe even tell us how villagers might have responded. And I'll try to make that case today. Other sources that I use, I'll touch upon a little bit today, are Buddhist tales. These seem to have been closely connected to preaching. People like Mifune Takayuki have recently kind of shown how these are connected to preaching networks that appear in Japan. And then finally, I use a host of other sources, which I won't really talk about today, which include national histories, canonical Buddhist texts, temple histories, etc. So now on to the traveling preachers. I want to start with a section from this text, Draft of Todaiji Liturgies. I apologize for all the text on the slide. I'm not going to read it all. I'm just putting this up here, and I'm going to kind of walk us through it piece by piece. So the first piece I want to highlight, I've circled in yellow here, and I couldn't get to the text I want to appear just in yellow. I should have done that. I think there are ways, but the parenthetical parts of my text are the parts that are circled in yellow. So he starts off saying, now this hall. So this is the beginning of a ritual of dedication. And he begins by saying, now this hall, and then parenthetically in the top right here of the screen, the way I see it at least, we can say it says village name, such and such, town here is called, and then he says such and such again, right? For what reason is it called such and such? And then parenthetically here, oops, I messed up again. It says, give the origin story for this. And then what's the name of the hall? Give the origin story for this. Notably, for two of these kind of parentheticals, he seems to have planned them into the manuscript, right? There's a space that's open. It's written in slightly smaller script, off-centered. One of them he kind of added after the fact. But this is important because it gives us actually quite a bit of information just in this small little fragment here. First, it tells us that he plans to be preaching in villages, in halls. And there's been a lot of scholarship on what village halls are. And it's a complicated question, but they seem to often be very small scale structures located in villages that often lack, but not always, but often lack resident clergy. And we have evidence in this manuscript and elsewhere that clergy were sometimes invited to these places to give sermons. Second thing we know, in addition to it being done in villages, is that he's doing this in multiple places, right? The only reason he needs to add things like village name, such and such town name here is because he's traveling into multiple villages. It's not just a one and done. He's repeating this. It's a generic text. We see more evidence of this if we go to the end, which I put in blue, where he says, if in the vicinity of mountains, stick to mountains. If groves and streams, stick to groves and streams. If in the vicinity of forts, stick to forts. This is a note to the self that is basically saying the section that precedes it is he's praising the water and the views and all of these things. And he says then, like, depending on what the scenery is around you, talk about those things. So like if I were in New Jersey, I would, talk about the industrial wasteland around me. No, I mean our beautiful gardens. That's the garden state. If I were in Singapore, I would talk about the Botanic Garden. I've never actually been to Singapore, but I hear that's quite beautiful. These are the types of things I would talk about. I would adapt my praise depending on where I am. This provides further evidence that he's traveling to a variety of locales. The reference to forts is especially interesting because based on this and other evidence, it may refer to the types of forts that are being built at the same time for the emishi campaigns in the East. So these are campaigns against kind of what might be another ethnic group in Eastern Japan by the state. Right above this, we have another interesting and important clue, which is by the station routes and large roads, there are conveniences of every manner. Here we learn that he's traveling by highways. Now, at this very moment in Japan, or in the preceding 100 years, I should say, in Japan, a large highway system had been constructed, one that actually equals the total of the present day Japanese highway system, excluding Hokkaido. So this enabled transportation and travel at volumes previously kind of impossible in Japan. He's talking then about the conveniences. He's probably using these official stations to travel. And we're going to see that kind of travel along these roads and to these stations seems to have been very important at this time in Japan. So just from this very short passage and these couple of parenthetical lines and then a few lines in the main text, we really get a sense that this is a manuscript that records notes to be used generically in a variety of villages, written by someone who was moving along by roads. That's quite a bit of information, actually. If we look at archaeological information, we actually have a lot of information about people who were serving multiple communities moving around. Now, I have one image here just because this one actually is kind of nicely illustrated, although it might not be the best example, but this seems to be a monk whose name is Gukan. The character that's kind of hard to read, the top character is it's an itaiji, a variant character for Ko, like Kobo Daishi no Ko, if you know that character. But it's a monk's, it seems to be a monk's name. I mean, it could be a nun as well. I think we shouldn't exclude that possibility. And what's interesting is we find it at 2 different village sites. So it seems to be, and this is tied to a broader discovery that archaeologists have made in the last 30 years, which is lots of villages, especially but not limited to Eastern Japan, seem to have very small scale structures like these village halls that it contained objects of Buddhist worship that Buddhist rituals were performed at. And here from the map, you can see that like, a little bit more than 2 kilometers apart, or right around 2 kilometers apart, we see the same name at multiple villages. Now we have other examples of this where it's like 20 kilometers apart. We also have cases where we have begging bowls that were produced in the capital that are found in the provinces. And so we can see kind of this flow of technology and movement and people between both villages within the provinces and between the capital and the countryside that seems to be happening at this time, all through archaeological evidence. So we can kind of confirm through the archaeological evidence that this type of thing is really going on. So now, what was the content of some of these sermons in the villages? Now, I'm not going to give an exhaustive thing. I'm really focusing in this talk just on the discourse around poverty. So one of the discourses around poverty is tied closely to giving. And there are a whole lot of reasons that people give, right? If we look at discourses of giving, it's actually really, really widespread throughout all religious traditions, right? So Christian preachers in early, Christianity are asking for alms. It's not surprising because a monk or a nun has to eat. But why are they telling their audience they need to give? And there's a whole lot of reasons for this. One is giving can save your loved ones. So we see a lot of preaching of, your parents or your ancestors or your wife or someone. Turns out they were not always the most honest of people, and now they're suffering in hell. Whereas you can see here, illustrated in a much later Japanese illustration of hell, they're being chopped up by demons. You don't want that, do you? Well, how should you save them? Make an offering today. We also have this discourse extending to yourself. You, in the future, might end up in a hell, being chopped up by demons. Don't want that to happen? Make an offering today. Right? So we have these types of reasons that preachers are commonly advancing. Those are 2 reasons. Not necessarily tied to poverty, but much more general. A third reason that we can actually see in some of the historical records is to get status. And I have Homer here telling us, now to see Mr. Burns for the promotion and raise. And in fact, we see that people got a promotion and raise by giving. So we have a number of records of 10 individuals, I believe, from Todaiji, some from Saidaiji, and also some from the Kokubunji in the provinces, who made offerings, figures often from the provinces, who made very large-scale offerings. Just to give you a sense of the scale, they would give thousands of coins. We're going to see these numbers later on. And for that, they would receive promotion into the court bureaucracy. So for rich people, a reason to give is not only to save yourself, but also to kind of join the court bureaucracy. So these are all reasons that would be especially attractive to the rich, but not limited to them. But for other people, we're also commonly told that you can get rich and avoid poverty by giving. We just see there's something in the chat, nothing important. Okay, so that you can get rich and avoid poverty by giving. So how does that work? I'm going to suggest that there's a broader discourse that we see. I'm not going to suggest, I'll tell you that there's a broader discourse that we see in these preaching sermons that I think works quite well with the American slang term of making it rain. And the idea is that the gift that you give will then rain down upon you, rewarding the people who gave the gift and the beneficiaries of the gift. And we see this in multiple places in the manuscript. There's a particularly interesting passage here that I want to read to you. If unexpectedly you obtain even a half pint of rice, you should concede it to the three jewels. The three jewels here are the Buddha, the so-called founder of the Buddhist tradition, the Dharma, right, the teachings, and the Sangha, the community. If by chance you receive even torn robes, you should distribute them to monks and nuns. The myriad celestials let fly clouds that rain refined white rice to reach starving bodies. The king Chakra, I think this is a reference to Indra, blows winds. It's like shakuo in Japanese. The king Chakra blows winds that produce ornate brocade adornments to clothe cold bodies. So what we have happening here is incredibly humble donations. That if you give just a small amount of food or even torn robes, this harkens back right to the destitute man in the poem that we opened with. If you give even these small amounts, they will return to you as wondrous foods and as brocade, wonderfully kind of like, this is the equivalent of Gucci, right? Garments that will kind of rain down upon you. So if I just give like my shabby, like if I stood up, you'd see I've got like kind of like, you know, scrubby jeans on. If I were to donate those kind of jeans with a hole in them, you know, like, I don't know, Versace suits or something like that would rain down upon me. So I think the discourse here is also cold bodies and starving bodies, right? So the idea is that by giving just a small amount, it will save the starving and the cold. It will save, in other words, the destitute. Finally, I think a final interesting point about this quote are the adverbs. Unexpectedly obtain even a half pint of rice, right? If you just get a small amount by chance. If by chance you get torn robes. So this doesn't seem to be necessarily targeting someone that's wealthy. The rhetoric seems to be targeting someone that at least is of lower means than the people who are donating large amounts and getting promotions into the court hierarchy. In another section of the manuscript, he tells people how they should give all of these really great generous gifts, and he's so grateful for the people that have given the generous gifts. But then he says, for people incapable of giving gifts, put just one coin into them, and then it's kind of scratched out. It's 80,000, 16 inexhaustible storehouse, there's a lacuna, but it's basically into the coffers. So he says, for people that are incapable of giving, just offer one coin into the coffers. So this doctrine seems to suggest that he's at least rhetorically targeting people who are incapable or less than capable of giving large amounts. We'll see later that he seems to even target people that are giving less than that. But on a rhetorical level, this seems to be something that this preacher is using in multiple places in the manuscript. If we look more generally at the discourse that's circulating around preachers at this time, we could look at the text, the Nihon Yoiki, which is a collection of Buddhist tales from around almost the exact same time. So Draft of Todaiji Liturgies seems to be from around the 830s, and the Nihon Yoiki just slightly predates this. So this text has a lot of different stories, but one of the things that's very interesting is it compiles numerous tales of impoverished women. There's a gender dynamic that we could return to in Q&A here, but it compiles numerous tales of impoverished women who offer flowers, incense, and oil. And these women are often described as like starving, like they didn't even have the means to eat. They're very much of the similar kind of description of the people like in the poem that I opened with, but they're able to kind of scrounge together through chance, oil or incense or flowers, and they make offerings to various Buddhist deities. In return, they receive rewards where they basically get rich. They get 4,000 or even an incredibly impressive amount of 100,000 coins, which would make them quite wealthy. Kyokai himself, in both commentaries of these stories and in a preface, describes the power of such humble gifts. He says, donating a pint of rice, we're at a half pint of rice. Now, if donating a pint of rice returns 30 days of food, and one set of clothing returns 1 year's supply. And then he says, by donating a dollop of food, you escape famine in the coming life. So if you give just a humble amount, there are big returns. So by these sources, then it seems that this type of discourse was really in the air in the 9th century on a rhetorical level, at least. But did people actually respond? And here's where I think the archaeological evidence can be quite interesting. And I'm going to introduce a few pieces of archaeological evidence here. check my time. All right, I need to speed up a little bit. So first we have in this picture here, this is a mokkan, an excavated wooden slip, where a prayer master seems to have led a fellowship. He seems to have been a lay person, but he could be a novice. It's not quite clear, but he seems to have a lay name from what we can read of it by Ason and something Nari. Leads a fellowship known as the Turtle Fellowship. I don't know what turtle means, but a fellowship is a Buddhist group that joins together to perform pious acts. Judging from the quantities donated, all of the quantities that are visible are less than 10. And someone once asked me when I presented on these materials, said, well, couldn't like the numbers be 73,842? But I've circled a couple examples that show that this is not the case. So for example, what's visible is we have a name that seems to maybe be Hirotari, followed by 2 coins. And then we have the character for coin, followed by 1 coin. These are incredibly small amounts. So like 5 coins can get you like a pint of soybeans. So some of these quantities are like, like literally like a cup of soybeans. If we look at the purchase value at the same time that this mokkan was produced, which is in 747. Scholars have looked at this mokkan and said that based on the date of it, it might be tied to fundraising for Todaiji's Great Buddha. Todaiji's Great Buddha was a project that was famously intended to be funded inclusively with donations of all sizes. So there seems to be evidence of people making really, really small donations. These are of a very, very different scale than the types of donations of thousands of coins that are being offered by wealthy people. And we can see from this, there's probably room for at least 20 names or so on this mokkan. So where was this mokkan uncovered? And this is, I think, quite interesting. The mokkan seems to have been uncovered very close to a station. Archaeologists have not yet excavated the station buildings. This would be the Ashia station on the Sanyodo, but they've excavated many potsherds that have the character for station. And interestingly for me, a lot of other potsherds that have to do with stations, as well as horse teeth. And so we have a large number of horse teeth that have been found at the site, and the horse teeth tend to be older horse teeth, which suggests that they were used for transportation and were likely, again, tied to the station. So if we were to kind of synthesize this material, it seems that we had fellowships active at stations, which we saw as where traveling preachers were also active, collecting donations for a project connected to the construction of Todaiji, offering very, very minuscule amounts. So what if we move to the village halls that I said draft of Todaiji liturgies was being preached in? Well, in these village halls, we find lots and lots and lots of pots, thousands and thousands of pots with inscriptions on them. Some of these pots have oil residue, which is interesting because I already alluded to kind of oil is commonly like, if you can just burn a little bit of oil and offer that, you will become rich. These pots I'm going to focus on for a moment are inscribed with the characters of Shitoku, Watashi ni eru. One could very poorly translate as gimme, or something like I privately or personally attain or obtain. These were found in large number. There's about 39 of them from this site. And what's fascinating is they radiate. This is my very analog version of my research. I apologize, I don't know how to do digital humanities yet, but they radiate around this building. This building is the kind of calling card architectural design of these village halls, characterized by a 4-sided veranda. And there's a lot of other Buddhist objects at the site. We know it was known as Ninboji Temple, is what it was called. And radiating in about a 50-meter radius from the site are all of these pots inscribed with Shitoku. So this seems to be tied to a Buddhist practice connected probably to this village temple where we've seen these traveling preachers were active. But what types of things do people want to privately obtain? We have a clue from one other piece of materials. I'd want to point out very quickly, that they all seem to be in different hands. So it seems that the villagers had been maybe inscribing the materials possibly themselves. They do not necessarily have to have been literate to do this. We have lots of other examples in Japan, including famously a site known as Onodera that has 1,000 roof tiles with different names that again seem to have been inscribed by people even of lower social class, but people just need to be able to kind of copy the pattern, right? So I suggest that might be possible by looking at the variety of calligraphic forms. But if we want to know what these people were praying for, what they were asking for, we have one prayer that's quite explicit at the same site, where they say they want to be furnished with assets or treasures, zaibi. That character for zai can also be read as takara, So it could be furnished with assets, furnished with treasures. But this type of prayer for wealth is exceedingly common at village temple sites. So I just have a collection of materials here that I'm going to kind of run through of the types of prayers that we commonly see. To gain wealth and assets, to get many profits, to receive great fortune, receive myriad, lots of stuff, right? The highest benefits for wealth to come, that's my favorite, right? Come here, wealth. Superior blessings and prosperity, abundant treasures. And we also have over 600 potsherds with the character of wealth. Now, some of those could be place names or person names, but given the large number in the broader context, a large percentage of those 600 are again likely prayers for wealth. And we have lots of characters with Zai, I think I counted more than 40. And so we see large numbers throughout, particularly in Eastern Japan, where these pots are most commonly found, of people making prayers for wealth within village communities, often tied to Buddhist sites. So what if you didn't have enough to give, right? This is my next point in the slide, is for those who can't give. What if you didn't have enough? What if you couldn't even give a single coin? What if you couldn't even scrounge together oil? Well, the preacher also advanced doctrines for those people. He said, for those without a single coin, for those lacking, put your palms together. For those lacking even incense, give rise to the mind of Bodhi. If you lack offerings, put your efforts toward the 3 acts of reverence. Perform obeisance with your body, make praise with your mouth, contemplate with your mind. If you can't make offerings, worship the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. This is called priceless and rare, all the Buddha's praise. So the most priceless and rare offering you can give is actually simple worship. Chanting, making obeisances, contemplation, thinking of the Buddha. All of these types of things are things that he encourages, particularly for those who lack any material objects to give, even incense, right? Which is really kind of, perhaps after flowers, the most humble offering one could make. So this is an example where the preacher seems to be offering practices for people who are so poor, they cannot even contribute a single penny or a half pint of food. Another example we see are lay precepts. So precept conferrals are increasingly common at this time, lay precept conferrals, often for temporary periods, right? So you'll uphold the precepts for a month or for a day or for a week. And precept conferrals are part of this manuscript. They appear in this text. And one of the things he says is that because of faith in the precepts, we are separated from the cause of poverty and baseness. So if you uphold the precepts, you will no longer be poor. And again, we similarly have stories of the this-worldly benefits that one gets from upholding precepts in narratives that are also circulating at this time. So that what I would argue would be another type of practice that would be accessible for those who could not even make offerings. All right, so far I think I've given a relatively rosy picture, but I want to kind of talk now about some of the darker sides, particularly as it connects to karma. So the preacher argued that rich and poor are distinct. And rich and poor are distinct because rich people were good in the past and poor people weren't. They were lousy, they were jerks, they were punks, they were bad, and that is why they are poor. And we see that in a lot of places in the manuscript, but I'm just going to highlight one quote, which is, if there is someone who in a past life at the place of the 3 treasures had a mind of veneration, then in this life they will become someone from an exalted family with envy of land and emoluments and be respected by all people. But if in a past life a person did not have a mind of veneration at the place of the 3 treasures, they will become someone of low class, impoverished and destitute, and will be reproached by all people, right? The rich people will look at them and wipe their tears with their $100 bills. So here, on the one hand, we've seen the preacher arguing a doctrine that says all of you have access to Buddhism. All of you have access to Buddhist ritual, and all of you can advance in your next births through your Buddhist ritual practices. But he also says, if you're poor now, that's your own fault. So I think I want to kind of stress here that this is not some rosy savior, exclusively kind of savior model. It's also one that is a prosperity gospel that blames the poor. At the same time, to kind of just throw one last piece of ambivalence and ambiguity here, is the impermanence of wealth. The preacher also tells his audience that the wealthy manner turns to an impoverished one. And the exalted person's household quickly becomes base. The reason for this is because the good that we made in previous times has exhausted itself and vanished. Naraka, which means hell, does not distinguish between exalted and base. The flames of the furnace and the boiling water of the cauldrons do not differentiate between rich and poor. And I have an image here again from Hell Scrolls that show the fires of hell. So ultimately, although in the past, you're poor because of your actions in the past, or rich because of your actions in the past, the preacher also stressed that this is not going to last. Now, I think we could, quite justifiably, cynically read this, right, to say that this is a good marketing tactic to get people to part with their wealth. But I think it's also an equalizing tactic, right? This is one that, again, kind of further dissolves the distinctions between rich and poor. So I think in this text, there's a kind of very complex balance that's happening. On the one hand, we're creating opportunities for the poor. On the other hand, we're creating opportunities that really dissolve any difference between the rich and the poor, right? The priceless and rare offerings are ones that even the poor can do. But then to go back again, the rich are rich because they were good in the past, but then to go back in a different direction, I feel like the guy in Princess Bride, you know, but on the other hand, if you are wealthy now, it will not last forever. Okay, so that's basically the end of my talk, and I just kind of want to wrap up and kind of summarize what I've talked about so far. So first, going back to the historical narratives that I started with, I hope we can see that Buddhism was popularized far earlier than is usually thought, right? It penetrated villages, it transcended social classes. There were accessible practices that were introduced that seemed to be targeting not simply aristocrats, but much humbler people in society. And that preachers were like thinking about this and considering it. And this happened from much, much earlier than we tend to think about for Japanese history. Second, that Buddhist preachers were mobilizing doctrines, right? They were actively thinking about these doctrines that would appeal to the poor. That to see this, we need different types of evidence. And one of the pieces of evidence we can see is archaeological evidence. And the strength, I think, of the archaeological evidence is that it gives us the other side. Whereas narratives and preaching notes tell us what the preachers wanted people to hear, the archaeological evidence, I think, might suggest, if you think I'm reading these materials correctly, that the poor themselves, in fact, responded to these ideas, and that maybe we should consider their agency. We need new sources and methods to see this, right? So we have to go to the backs of manuscripts, right? Manuscripts that are written on the backs of other manuscripts and archaeological materials. If we want to overcome these narratives, we need to look at different types of sources than the ones we've usually used. At the same time, as I kind of tried to stress at the end, it's not just like a rosy picture that I think we can kind of latch on as something that's, you know, a useful resource for now, because it's one that blames the poor, right, for their state, but also I think offers them a way out and promises that status is impermanent. And finally, I want to end by saying that this is really radical, right? This is a completely new worldview that explains your existence in the past, that explains ethics, that explains ritual, that creates new notions of what it means to be poor, what it means to be rich. It introduces an entirely new way of seeing the world, one that's connected closely to social class, ethics, and ritual, that all I think emerged in the 8th and 9th century, and really probably in some ways we could argue, following William Lafleur, created a new episteme for Japanese society moving forward. I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much for your patience and your time, and I really look forward to our conversation. 43 minutes, I went a couple minutes longer than expected.
No, you definitely did what you said you would do. It's fantastic in terms of timing and content. Thank you so much, Bryan. Awesome talk, really appreciate it. And I'm so glad that so many of our students, but also friends from around the world were here, could be present here. And I do hope that you will all put your questions in the chat. There are some there already waiting to be asked. What I will do is I will first ask one question of my own, but then please do put your question in the chat, and I will ask you to then come on video or audio if you are indecent to ask your question to Bryan. Okay. I guess I'm always asking big picture questions at the end of a talk. You know, when I think about the, hell imagery, I often think to myself, how natural did this seem to people, right? Who, it's not entirely clear how much exposure they had to quote unquote Buddhism, right? Whether we're talking about, early Chinese Buddhism or early Indian Buddhism, early Sri Lankan Buddhism, early Japanese Buddhism, how much exposure does a given community have to Buddhist ideas before they go, ah, hell, that makes sense, right? And I think about this in relationship to this question of how do you know you are poor? And the question of relative deprivation as driving, basically most sociological analyses for understanding how poverty works and how the identity of being poor works in a society. And I think about this, the language of hell, but also this comparison point, right? I'm going to donate because I'm poor so that I become wealthy, right? Implies something about the idea that there is this gap, maybe a yawning gap between where you stand and presumably somebody else who has more, right? The human imagination is actually fairly limited, right? We have to see examples of what it is that we want before we want it. Tends to be the case. That's my materialist impulse coming through here, I guess. But what does this brutality of an impoverished existence through metaphors like hell, or real places, excuse me, like hell, tell us about connectivity among quote unquote impoverished and quote unquote rich communities in the societies, maybe even villages that we're talking about, if we don't talk about Japan as a whole, right? But an individual community being exposed to something different via these connectivities, such that the image of a prosperity gospel, and the sort of implicit critique there is of one's low status as having to do with or playing into a whole metaphysical, cosmological, karmatic scheme that will somehow make sense, such that all of the archaeology really means something to people, including the desire for moving from your benighted condition to the elevated status of the wealthy. So it's a big picture question. You can attack it however you want.
Okay, good. I'll try my best. There's a lot there, so I won't be able to answer all of it. And part of the reason I won't be able to answer all of it, of course, is also we just don't have sources, right? So one thing that's hard is it's hard to know how people responded to ideas of hell, particularly in this early period, because I don't think there's anything in the archaeological evidence that could really tell us that. But I would say a couple things. I mean, I think in some ways this is a question about intelligibility, right? How were these things made intelligible to large groups of people? And first, I would say your question's actually making me rethink the manuscript a little bit, which is, I don't think that this is always necessarily the first experience these people have necessarily had with Buddhism. So I think by the time this manuscript is produced in the first decades of the 9th century, people likely already had some exposure to Buddhism. So village temples start to emerge in the late 8th centuries and into they continue to be built basically from the last quarter of the 8th century into the first half of the 9th century. And that's when they kind of peak. And so at that point, things are already happening. So I think there's already some degree of a background that we have no access to, that we just don't know. So I don't think things are happening right away. Second thing I would say that in terms of a strategy, I think one of the ways it happens that we can see is through stories. And one of the things I think that preachers really, and I'm going to try to work on this somewhere in my book manuscript to talk about, is they really try to ground their doctrines to very, very specific places. So if you look at the stories in the Nihon Yoiki, they're all set in a particular village. And Mifune has looked at these and kind of looked at how certain motifs tend to be tied to certain areas. And he's argued that there were actually probably preachers active in those geographic areas preaching similar motifs. That's the kind of secondary to what I was going to say. What I was going to say is that even in Draft of Todaiji Liturgies, there's a very interesting passage where it says, in this land, in this realm, or in this province, it's the same character for province and realm, so it's not clear, but I think it's probably in this province. It's like a farmer went into the fields and they burst into flames, and then it says, which basically means like kind of keep going, just kind of ad lib for the rest of it. And there are a lot of stories like that in Chinese sources and in the Nihon Yoiki, which basically describes someone who, because of their bad karma in the past, they went out into the world around them turned into hell, like in that moment, appeared as hell, and they thought like swords are stabbing them and things. So it seems to be one of those stories that he would tell. But what's interesting to me is that he starts the story, and he actually writes in the margins after that, Yoiki, which is probably, but not necessarily, the Nihon Yoiki. So this tells us that he's telling stories and he's trying to tie it to very particular places. So he wants, and I think that's important because I think one of the things that does is it says, hey, all of you people that live in this village, this could happen to you too. And so I think that's one of the ways that we're kind of transcending class and tying people together, is tying them together by these geographic designations. And I would say that one of the evidence that we see that I talk about in my first book is people that join these fellowships often identify themselves along these same geographic designations by a district, by a village, which are official categories created by the state. And so we see this kind of recognition of grouping people together in new ways that are geographically determined that I think might bond people together. And then finally, I would just say that I think the stories and the notions of karma really try to transcend class and create some sort of a unified experience. Now, was that effective or was it not? I think that's a much harder thing to answer, but on a rhetorical level, I think the notion of karma is in some ways kind of intended as an equalizer in ways that can both kind of reinforce class distinctions, but also dissolve them. So I'll stop there to have other questions. I hope that at least answered some of your questions, but I might not have gotten all of it, and I apologize.
It was a huge sort of can of worms, but no, excellent. That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Bryan. Okay, so opening it up, let's just begin from the beginning. One of our wonderful students here, undergraduate Amira, who is writing for her senior thesis actually on medieval Japanese Buddhism. And I'd like to ask her to come on and ask, apparently she's channeling Chopin and asking about business, the business of ritual. Okay, Amira, do you want to unmute yourself?
Hi, Professor. Thank you for this talk.
Thank you.
Yeah, I actually have two questions. So the first one is about your book, Ritualized Writing. I was just thinking whether this actually show a type of business transaction, like Buddhism as a business transaction rather than a religion. Because I was just thinking of Buddhism as a more practical way rather than a more kind of like a more nuanced sort of way, rather than a strict spiritual way. So that's the first question. The second question is about impermanence from wealth, the very end part of your lecture. I was just thinking, until when the sources actually mention when does like Naraka happen, and if that happens, how did the people around this think about this idea, and how did they actually receive this idea? And the last one is actually just a comment. The part about gift giving actually kind of like resonates with me, because like I'm Muslim, and there's this part about the Islamic teaching where gift giving is important even though you're poor. So like giving alms even if you're poor is better than not giving at all, because you're believed to get multiple fold in terms of immaterial wealth. So they're talking in a more capitalistic sense. So I was just thinking whether, I don't know, it's just a comment. Maybe we want to comment a bit about that. So yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me actually start with a comment first. And I'd love if you send me by email or something like that, or pass on to Nick a reference for the Islamic practices, because I'm always very interested in comparative things. But let me just say really quickly that this isn't limited to my materials, but something we see more broadly in the Buddhist tradition. So Liz Wilson has a really excellent article. I can't remember the title of it now, but I can find it later and send it. But Liz Wilson has a really excellent article. I think it's called Beggars Can Be Choosers or something like that. It's a book chapter. But she argues that in Buddhist texts that are composed in South Asia, that we similarly have this discourse that the best gifts are those from the poor. And in fact, we see this type of discourse in a lot of Buddhist canonical texts too, that poor people kind of make the best gifts. There's one where a poor woman offers oil and a king offers oil, and her oil burns a lot longer than the king's oil, with the kind of implication that, she's offering more by giving this. So it's something that we see really commonly in Buddhism. I couldn't get into that today, but I have that in the book chapter, like a whole section on kind of Buddhist examples for this. So I just wanted to point that out. Second, let me just go to the impermanence. I'll go in reverse order of how you asked them. So, generally the question of when does Naraka happen, right? When does hell happen? The traditional Buddhist canonical answer is like, you don't really know, is that when you perform actions, they're like seeds, and when they will come to fruition could be at any time, which is a great teaching because it's really frightening, because you think you're being good, but it could be something you did 20 lifetimes ago, could come and get you now, right? But in Japan, I would say at this time, there seems to be a much greater concern with like very immediate retribution. So the Nihon Yoiki, the stories are very much about kind of retribution that you get like right away, or like right after you die in your next life. And that seems to be the main concern that people have. So it seems to be pretty quick in terms of how it's actually being communicated on the ground, although the larger Buddhist doctrine is more unpredictable and more long-term. The business versus religion, I mean, I think I never want to kind of answer a question by rejecting the question, but I do want to just point out, as others have argued, the concept of religion as a separate sphere from business isn't something that necessarily exists in this time, right? So the idea that business and religion and economics are separate is, I think, kind of in some ways a modern idea. So I'm a little bit nervous to assume that separation. But that said, I mean, economic activity is really, really crucial here, right? And I think part of the things that we have to remember is, one, for these types of construction projects, for monks to eat and all these things, they require lay donations, right? The Sangha is only possible through the generosity of lay people to a large degree. What I would say, though, is I think the donations from the poor actually don't help them very much. Somebody pointed this out to me before, that if you're collecting donations, you really want to go after big donors. You don't want to get a lot of people to give you, like in the US, $10, right? I mean, that you can, in the modern social media age, it's a little bit easier to do it. People like Bernie Sanders could do it relatively effectively. Still ultimately did not win, did not get as much money. And going after the Goldman Sachs people is the way that you want to actually collect donations. And so I do think preachers here are attentive to both. And I think there is definitely a business element to this, but I wouldn't want to read it cynically either, because I think it's just necessary for monks to engage in economic life. I'll stop there in the interest of other questions. There's more I could say, but thank you for the wonderful questions and thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Amir, and thank you, Brian. Maybe I'll jump around a little bit here. Can I ask Nadia Kanagawa to come on and ask her question?
Hey, Nadia.
Hey, what a great talk. And I'm sorry that I'm jumping ahead of students. I think these questions are wonderful, but the question that came to my mind as you were talking, first I was going to ask, like, who are these OneCoin donations going to? You gave the example of the donations going to Todaiji. And so this sort of got me thinking about, who are these preachers? What kind of networks are they involved in? And if they are out there getting all these kind of humble people to donate to Todaiji, it suggests that at least some of them are connected to these central institutions. And so then how does that bring us back to that idea of state Buddhism?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. And I was talking to Nick beforehand. He was saying that, one of the things in a different article I wrote that he took away is kind of ways we can think about the state. And I was saying to him, like, it's interesting to hear that, and he's right. But I have this really kind of complicated relationship with the state, because on the one hand, I want to think past the state, but on the other hand, you can't exclude the state from our discussion, right? And so your question, I think, really beautifully raises, like, why that's a problem. So preachers that are active collecting alms and traveling to villages, I think are probably of two different types. And we have one type, this is actually helpful because I'm going to go back and write this chapter later, and I actually haven't framed it this way, so I'm thinking aloud here. But one type are people who are being invited from temples in the capital, like Daianji, Todaiji, the main temples in the capital, Gangoji, to go to the provinces and perform rituals. And I think the author of our manuscript, that draft of Todaiji liturgies, is one of these people. Related, a subset of those people would be people based at Kokubunji Temple. So for those of you that are new to this period in Buddhism, in the middle of the 8th century, these temples were built, pairs of monasteries and nunneries were built in every single province, totaling, I think, 68, I want to say. It's not clear if all of the nunneries were built. In certain regions, they all seem to have built, in other regions they weren't. But anyway, these are official temples promoted by the emperor that perform memorial rituals, healing rituals, and state protection rituals for the court at them. And we have evidence of the figures from these temples also kind of going out and being invited to perform rituals in the provinces. So that's one group of people who are closely tied to the temples in the capital, who are being invited, often by prominent people in the provinces, to go out and perform sermons. The second group is happening on a much more informal grassroots level. And these are people that are often not formally ordained, that are moving around and traveling from place to place. There's one really interesting example that I read with, I see my student Kevin, Kevin, a student I've worked with here, is here. We read one of the source in a seminar last year, but there's one example of like a lay woman that comes, I think, from Echizen, and she gets arrested for like preaching in the marketplaces in Nara, which is really interesting. And then she gets exiled and sent back. So we have these kind of informal people that are happening as well. I think for the donations that are coming from Todaiji are happening through the people of the first camp. And what I would say is, I think this is where wealthy patrons are actually really important, because these wealthy patrons are the people that have connections that can make the invitations. And so in my book, I talk about different strata of temple that are being constructed. And I think the earliest temples in provincial Japan are being constructed by wealthy people. And it's their networks, connections with these temples by wealthy provincial figures, that are allowing Buddhism to spread then into the villages. So I think the state does play a really strong role as enabling certain types of networks to form. but I don't think the state has control over the results of those networks, if that makes sense. And that's how I would try to answer the question for now, but it's something I'm still working through in the first 3 chapters of the book, especially, and then also returning to in the last chapter as well. Thank you.
Great. Maybe we can actually ask Kevin Woolsey to come on and ask his question.
Hi, thank you for the talk. So I had kind of 2 related questions, but you already kind of answered one. But anyways, my main question is, given the importance of preaching to presumably those illiterate audiences in your project, I was wondering if you could talk about the topic of speech and orality, especially considering the person in the Fujimonko. You said, they could have been traveling as far as modern day Tohoku. And so I imagine there's significant linguistic differences in not only regional, but also based on social class. And also related to that, which you kind of already talked about, is, the types of people who are doing the preaching. Like, for, say, someone working out of the Kokubunji temple, would they be like a local from that area who went to get training in Nara and then went back, or something like that?
So let me just say really quickly, on the Kokubunji front, there's different stages and different histories, but a lot of times the people are being appointed and then sent from the capital, and then it does change. They start to recruit local people as well. But there does seem to be a real flow going back and forth between the provinces, the capital, and then back out to the provinces again. So I think that's really important. The other question about speech and orality is a really interesting one, and I could say a whole, I could give a whole talk on this, and I've given talks about it a little bit before. There are a lot of things I could say. So let me first, dialect you brought up. There's a couple interesting and very famous passages in the manuscript where he actually makes reference to dialects, where he says, like, the Buddha basically said you should preach in the dialect of the land you are. And if you were, he lists like different countries in like Central Asia, he's like, if you were, I can't remember the exact ones, but it's like if you're in Kucha or something, he's like, you should preach in that language. And he says, if you were in Hida, which is like Gifu region of Japan now, then you should preach in that dialect. And then he says, like, and then the dialect of this country. And so he does seem to be aware of the dialects. Now, how much dialect do they know? How much is Japan a universal language? I mean, at this point, that gets tricky. I know scholars that work on the Manyoshu do a lot of work with the dialects of the different poems, and I need to kind of look into that more to see how much is intelligible. But there does seem to be an awareness of that in the manuscript. The other 2 things I would say about orality is there are several styles of speech in the manuscript, but there are 2 in particular that I would highlight. One is there's a lot of parallel prose, which is very, very flowery, ornate, poetic language. All of you that know kind of Chinese literary styles, this is kind of how you write in a literary way. But what's interesting to me is if you count out the characters, if you look at the characters in parallel prose, they're not parallel prose when they're written. They have like uneven parallelisms in terms of the numbers of characters, because there are characters, there are compounds, there are all these things. But if you take the meaning of the characters, they come out like very much as a parallel expression. And so I think they're kind of what I've argued, and I've talked to your advisor, Brian Steiner, about this, and he's seen this in later materials, is they're like oral parallelisms, which I think points to the orality of the manuscript, right? The manuscript's not intended to be read as a written text, but rather to be beautiful performative language where an audience could hear these types of parallelisms. They could catch where the verbs are and the adverbs and the different things, and they could hear this poetic language as a parallelism. And so I think that's really an interesting case because it's poetic language that's clearly intended to be oral. Secondly, is there are lots of places where it seems to imply ad lib. And I mentioned this before with the story, where it just gives you kind of the framing of the story, and then it just says, mm-hmm. And there's one of the more interesting parts of the manuscript is a biography of the Buddha. And it's like really abbreviated. So it's like, I don't know, it says like white elephant, mother's side, like 7 steps. And then after each one, it says like, And so they're like little cues, and at that point in the manuscript, he would tell the story of the Buddha, but it's just giving you his outline. Like, it looks like my lecture notes. It's like, okay, remember this point, remember this point, remember this point. And I think it suggests that a lot of the manuscript would be delivered in a vernacular quality that's kind of just spoken freely and not necessarily from a script, whereas other parts that are in parallel prose would probably be done from a script. So there's all these different linguistic features, but it seems to me that the preacher is really concerned with the oral affect of his sermon, and that's why I'm going to have a whole book chapter that I haven't written yet on homiletics in this manuscript, because I think that's a really central part. So thank you for your question.
Thank you so much. Can we ask Alistair, another one of our students, to come on?
Okay, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I can.
All right. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for your talk, Professor Lowe. One of the points that you raised interested me very much, which has to do with the copying of the words on pottery. And you said that, you know, just because people are writing out these characters doesn't mean they're actually literate in what they're writing. So I just want to ask, you know, do you frequently see all these kanji mutating into things that people didn't intend because they were just copied wrongly? Because even literate people, you know, writing out characters sometimes just get it completely wrong. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, so these pots are really especially common in Eastern Japan. Interestingly, it's a little bit unclear to tell if that's because excavations have been much more exhaustive in Eastern Japan because of so Chiba is where the things are found the most, but Chiba is also a place that was really well excavated because of all of the kind of growth of commuter towns, Tokyo. So we see those. We also see roof tiles. And I think if I remember correctly at Onodera, I'd have to confirm this, so I don't want to say it with a great deal of confidence. We see kind of mistakes as well in characters and things. And so we do see this. We see, I know, in things that David Laurie has talked about, we see things written backwards and swords and stuff like that from earlier periods. So these are all examples, I think, of things that you're describing, where it seems like there are accidents that suggest that literacy wasn't the main thing. And David Laurie, one of his arguments is he describes the text, I think he uses the word alegible, not illegible, but alegible, meaning that they're not necessarily intended to be read, right? And I think that's really important, is that kind of words themselves have power and aren't necessarily, they don't even need to necessarily be written correctly or with any intention to be read. Your question also reminded me of a story in the Nihon Yoiki, which describes a woman who is writing. She's copying a sutra, I believe, and she's ridiculed by someone who's passing by. And these stories are common in the Nihon Yoiki. Whenever you ridicule anyone doing something pious in Buddhism, you're punished. And that person's mouth is twisted instantly upon doing it. But he's laughing at her because she's messing up the characters. So that's another piece of evidence, I think, of kind of people with limited literacy writing. So I think there is a fair amount of evidence for this practice. I wish there were a little bit more that you could kind of firmly say. I should actually mention that piece in my chapter. I add that little story from the Nihon Yoiki. I hadn't thought to add that before. Make a note to myself. But yeah, so I think there is evidence of that. And then I would say the other thing is Dunhuang. There's a good dissertation by Rebecca Schwang-Fu that looks at Dunhuang manuscripts and similarly argues that there seem to be people who weren't literate who are kind of able to kind of scratch out and inscribe their name in different ways. So she has a really good section on that in her dissertation that came out from the University of Pennsylvania, maybe in the last 5 years, for kind of a comparative East Asian case as well. So that's kind of a short answer. I kind of wish there was a smoking gun, but I think there are bits and pieces.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Alistair. Thank you, Brian. Okay, Nick Lowe, can you come on? Another of our students.
Hi, Professor Lowe. Thank you for a very fascinating talk. I guess I don't know very much about Buddhism, but Buddhism in Japan, but so this comes from a point of ignorance, really. I'm curious if you come across evidence expressing skepticism towards the narratives, the preachers you talked about, outlined, whether the prosperity gospel or this notion that, oh, if I'm poor and I give just a little bit, I'll get so much in return. I could see how maybe that's something that's hard for people to believe, especially if, the conditions of their poverty are as abject as they, as the sources make it out to be.
Yeah. That's a good question. So in later periods, you do, but significantly later, right? So in the early modern period, when a movement known as the Kokugaku, often translated as kind of the nativist movement, which I'll just use for shorthand, emerges, they're very critical of Buddhism, and they're kind of like, these people are charlatans, and they're just making up all this stuff. And from earlier periods, like how much pushback was there, and how much do people kind of reject this? It's a little bit harder to see. We do sometimes see tensions with indigenous. I actually don't like, I've done numbers of Twitter threads. I can't believe I just said indigenous. I've done long Twitter threads arguing why Shinto is not an indigenous religion of Japan, but why local kami beliefs sometimes, in very rare cases, but sometimes come into tension with Buddhas. So that's a place where we see kind of tension, although not necessarily a skepticism of the whole worldview. But the one thing I would say that we see legal codes and actual punishments for monks who are like recklessly preaching merit and sin. Is I think it goes something like that in the legal codes. This is in the Soniryo, which are 8th century laws. It's actually incorrectly translated in one of the English translations where I can't remember what they say, but they say like getting profit from crime, but that's not actually what it means. It's actually merit and sin. And so that seems to be that some state officials thought there could be some form of preaching about these things that was considered reckless. And we know Gyoki, kind of the great popularizer of kind of the era around the capital of Buddhism. It's the one kind of famous monk from this period who ends up being tied into the Todaiji project, and also is really central at this place, Onodera, I mentioned, that has all the roof tiles with the names. He's criticized by the court for some of his activities. So there is sometimes kind of official criticism of people like recklessly preaching these things. How much are people like actively just rejecting the whole thing? It's hard to tell. So the other piece of evidence I would say, as I'm kind of thinking aloud here, is we have stories. For example, there's one great story, if I remember it correctly, of like a husband who doesn't want his wife to go to Buddhist sermons. He seems kind of suspicious of the whole thing. And he's kind of trying to prevent her from going. And then like an ant comes and bites his penis and like he dies or something like that. It's a great story. But like that's like a jealous husband, and he seems kind of jealous and suspicious of the preacher. So I think it's easy to imagine that there were people rejecting this, but most of the sources we have are very much through a Buddhist lens. So we see less of that until later periods. But I don't think we could say it's non-existent either.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Nick underplays his expertise. His expertise is not in Japanese Buddhism, but he is an expert in actually South Asian and Southeast Asian Tantra. So I'm sure he will apply your answer well to his own context.
Yeah, I gotta say it was fascinating. Thank you really so much.
No, thank you. Now I want to learn more about your work. Southeast Asia especially, I always feel like we don't know enough about, and want to know more. So.
Okay, can I ask Brian Rupert to come on and ask his question?
Okay, well,
hey, Brian.
Yeah, Brian, it's a great talk, and I'm following up on. You're a great storyteller, I mean, it's very entertaining. But anyway, this is really an important revision, and I feel like I'm asking the same question I guess I heard another talk recently where I had a similar question. But yeah, this whole issue of I don't even like these categories in some ways, the medieval versus the ancient and so on. But this issue of preaching and how different is this from what comes later, and the activities from it seems that we just have a lot more material from the 11th century onward, and there's certainly all these things going on, and certainly in Eastern Japan we have plenty of archaeological evidence, but I'm curious of how you interpret. How would you distinguish between the two, or do you see this as a kind of, straight, somewhat straight narrative or a line of, spreading of Buddhism outward into the,
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And I mean, I feel like since you're the medieval expert, I actually just want to say, like, Brian, could you tell me what's different from what I just described? But I'll try my best to answer the question. Let me first say that
difficult, right?
I think the dissertation I want someone else to write, not me. I mean, I want someone to write a dissertation on like the Agui materials, because we have this whole like Agui preaching tradition that's really important in Tendai, and there are all of these bodies, and they've been published, and we have these materials, but like there's nothing in English that I really know of on Agui preaching. It's so I really want someone to do that dissertation on medieval Tendai preaching in Japan, because I think that would be really great to do it. And I tried to look at those materials a little bit once, and I was like, oh, yeah, that's it's too much, and I can't do it. And there's that really great dissertation on early modern preaching by whose name I'm forgetting. It was never published into a book, but there's like a dissertation on Jodo Shinshu preaching in like Edo period.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it sounds big.
Anyway, I can't remember Harrison. Anyway, so there's a little bits in here, pieces here, but a lot of my knowledge, it's kind of like I wish more people would work on it, and I could answer that question better. But what I would say is I did look. I wrote this piece that's going to come out in a couple of years in the new Nanzan guide on homiletics. And what I tried to do in that piece is I tried to kind of cover all of Japanese Buddhist history on different themes. And what I would say, it's on a rhetorical level, I think we see a lot of similar strategies. So we see, similar notions of preaching in attention to kind of storytelling as a mode of preaching, right? We see similar issues with flowery language and parallel prose. We see similar themes with hell and stuff like that. But I wouldn't say there are no changes. So one change that might happen is a change of using more media. Like, so for example, Bryan knows about this practice known as eitoki, but preaching with pictures.
Right.
In China, we have examples that Buzzy Teiser has talked about preaching with the image of the cycle of birth of the 6 wheels, and using that as an image that people seem to have maybe stood before and preached. But in the ancient period, it's not clear if people are using visual aids. There's no evidence in my manuscript, except him praising Buddhist images of statues, but that they're really using visual aids to preach. And so I don't know if that's something that comes later. And Japan develops this really rich kind of performing arts tradition tied to media later on. And so that's something I don't see in the ancient period. And the other thing I would say is, from what I understand of later periods, is we start to get these a stronger sectarian bent, particularly tied to things that you're interested in, maybe even not sectarian, but lineages.
Yeah.
And so there become these preaching lineages where certain techniques and doctrines get passed down. And I don't see evidence of that in earlier periods. So those are a couple ways that I can point to differences. So I think, like anything, there's some commonalities and some differences. But really the answer is that we need a lot more work on this topic. And I'm looking forward to other people doing that in the future.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, this is a great talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bryan. It's great to see you. Bryan's my senpai.
He dies senpai, obviously.
So
maybe we'll have one more question from our student Xiaoya. This is a meta question, and we don't have enough time for it, but it's interesting. And the question of climate: is there a relationship between climate and connectivity in the period we're talking about here, 7th to 9th centuries? Maybe nothing at all. I don't know. But Xiaoya, do you want to come on very quickly and just ask?
Hi, Prof. Thank you so much for this amazing talk. So my question might be a little bit off because it's related to bioarchaeology. So previously, there's a report saying in early medieval Japan, which is before the Little Ice Age in Japan, roughly is 10th century to 13th century, they're using the human skeletons to kind of like investigate the mortality rate and to infer the violent events. And they found out that in the early medieval Japan, they actually have the highest mortality rate among the young adults, especially for males, and compared to the late medieval Japan, Edo period. So they're talking about how the climates have the influences over the populations, and considering about this kind of like religious practice changes during this like similar period. I'm just wondering, is there kind of like a link between how the climate influence the human behaviors and those kind of human behaviors relate to the changes in the religion?
It's a great question. And my short answer is I don't know, but I'm sure that there is a relationship, right? Because how can there not be a relationship between climate and human behavior? So I think you're right, and I should probably consider it more. What I would say is a couple things, which is first, if you read sources from this material, there are disasters happening all the time right now. How much can we attribute to climate or not? It's hard to know, but there are famines that are constantly happening. There are earthquakes, there's rainstorms, there's droughts, there are all these kind of weather phenomena. I don't have the expertise, and I haven't read enough of the scholarship to know how much we can kind of relate that to changes in climate patterns in things or not. But I think that's probably there and something we consider. Two other points is Wayne Farris's kind of classic work, looks at, there's a smallpox epidemic that comes in the middle of the late 730s, like 737 around. There's this huge smallpox epidemic that might wipe out like 30% or so of the Japanese population. So this is kind of in the wake of that. And he's kind of argued that we see kind of a general kind of decline and stagnation of Japanese population in this period. And so those kind of ideas of death being everywhere could certainly be there. But the thing that I've actually highlighted in my own work is that there's a new type of death that is definitely very clearly emerging, tied to the environment, which is a changed human environment. And I think the changed human environment is created by the construction of roads, is one of the main things. I know Michael Como is actually working on urbanization as well right now, so that would be kind of an interesting element to look at as well. But the construction of roads, I've argued elsewhere in this history of religions piece, means that people are moving in unprecedented ways. And when you start to move in unprecedented ways, you start to die in unprecedented ways. You die on the roadside. And we have lots and lots of edicts of this being a problem, where the court is being like, people keep dying on the roadways. We have to do something about it. How can we stop this? People propose to plant fruit trees. They make all these different proposals. But the man-made change of the environment by constructing roads definitely has effects that the preacher himself responds to by creating rituals for those who died on the road. And so I don't know about the natural climate changes, but I would say kind of man-made construction definitely alters the natural landscapes and changes society in ways that do affect religion. So that doesn't directly answer your question, but those are a few things I thought about when I heard your question. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Xiaoya.
Thank you, Prof.
So we're approaching the 11th hour, both 11th hours. And so I wanted to close and thank Professor Bryan Lowe for coming to NTU to talk with us today. It was a wonderful talk, and thank you so much for dealing with the marathon of questions. I don't know where your mind's at after having gone in so many different directions. Really appreciate you staying on to answer all the questions of students and guests. And thank you all to everybody who attended from all over the world.